The South African Coalition for Transitional Justice hosted the National Reparations Conference in Johannesburg over the past 2 days, discussing reparations for apartheid-era human rights violations. Now, the conference aims to address the unfinished business of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, hoping to find a path to justice and healing for South Africa. Now, Chairperson of South African Coalition for Transitional Justice, Shirley Gunn, joins us now. Shirley, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. This is a conference which brought survivors of apartheid conflict together from across the country, hoping for some closure and finding a path to justice. I would imagine that issues of accountability would have been central.
Yes. Well, let me just firstly clarify. I'm the Executive Director of the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice, not the Chairperson. I used to be the Chairperson, and it was a very historic moment, really, because this has been a very long, painful struggle to arrive at this juncture where we have a range of civil society stakeholders and representatives of various communities present, and the Department of Justice. So it was historic because there's been great delays and pain, additional pain on people's lives, that there's been such a slow progress. And I think also the limitation of the way in which the act is interpreted is confining the victim community to those who were identified by the TRC. And we're in discussion now about how there can be further registrations for people who are left out.
Yeah.
So yes, accountability is a critical question here.
So as you look back to when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission closed its doors, the impact of some of the thorny issues which have now resulted in intergenerational trauma, cries of very little support, what have the families had to say?
Well, I think there's a desperation across the country, a lack of recognition, lack of services, lack of the services that should have also been implemented post the TRC, like housing and education and healthcare and psychosocial services. So without any of that, the trauma is passed on to the next generation. So it wasn't really families as such that we were it were individuals that were elected through provincial meetings, and who were then representing their provinces at this particular national conference that was held over 2 days. And concluded today, and I'm very happy to say that it was a good outcome. Eventually, a very painful story actually to bear witness to again, and but I think the Department of Justice is showing a great willingness to partner with civil society and victim organizations to really resolve the problems of a very slow and incomplete process.
Maybe let's, you talk about a good outcome, and of course the problems here are what have brought you to this point where you are actually in discussion with the Department of Justice. What have been the biggest loopholes since the Commission handed over the recommendations to government? I mean, many families I've heard over the years feeling left out of that entire process.
Well, there's the time frame of the Human Rights Violations Committee was very short. In fact, only 18 months. And in that period, not everyone was ready to speak and to come forward with their statements. Not everyone had all the documentation that they needed to hand over to the TRC for their case to be considered, and for there to be a finding that there were in fact victims of gross human rights violations. And so for various reasons, there were scores of people who didn't come forward during the life of the TRC. And in 2003, the TRC, in the final volume, had recommended that the process is continuous, that it's not confined to what is now known as the closed list of 22,500 people. And of those, not everyone could be traced, because there was a long delay of 5 years from the time of handing over the TRC report to Nelson Mandela by the TRC to the time when eventually reparations were paid out. And it was substantially less than what was recommended. I'm talking here in terms of the monetary individual payment, was substantially less than what the TRC had recommended. So, I think if you delay something by 5 years, you're going to find difficulty in tracing everybody. And then there were a few some that didn't feel that they needed that money. They had enough and they didn't need the reparations, which was 30,000. But for those who did receive 30,000, it didn't settle the scores that they had in the hospital bills and the operations that they needed, or prosthesis, or many of the in order to redress the harm that had been caused.
I know there've also been questions
was a great
around
disappointment, actually, that was implemented into.
I know there's also been questions around the President's Fund. I mean, questions and, of course, some potential action that has been sought there as you try and follow the paper trail.
Every single year, and the department would claim that it's been a clean audit every single year. But there are some red flags that we have picked up in our own research. And that is the way in which the President's Fund is invested in the PIC, in quite risky types of investment. And there's not a transparency around that. We have absolute confidence that money is not used for anything else other than for the beneficiaries that it was raised for initially, but we're not at all happy about how it is invested and the details around that.
Yeah.
We would like that information. And also, the big thing is that there's legislation now being drafted, or regulations rather, being drafted around housing and not education, housing and other benefits, health. But there still must be a consultative process. And this is a long time after the closure of the TRC that people are now finally being awarded the type of support that they've needed for so long. And so many people have already died. We can't delay a day longer than what has happened so far.
Thank you so much.
And,
for speaking to us.
The Department of Justice.
Okay, finish the part about the Department of Justice.
Yes, thank you. The Department of Justice will also bring together the other ministries that are responsible for reparations, and so that there can be a more holistic approach and inclusive approach to reparations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. That was the Executive Director of the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice, Shirley Gunn, there, expanding on some of the ways forward as people seek justice.